In the summer of 1941, the Prut River marked not only a geographical boundary, but a fault line of competing ambitions. The region of Bessarabia, lying between the Prut and Dniester, had been incorporated into the Soviet Union the year before, following the ultimatum of June 1940. Romania, which had reluctantly ceded the territory under pressure, regarded this loss as both a national humiliation and a strategic danger. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 presented Bucharest with an opportunity to reverse this outcome. Aligning with Hitler's Germany, Romania sought to recover Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, while at the same time reasserting its place as a regional power whose loyalty to the Axis might secure other disputed territories. The decision to commit to the Axis war effort was not taken lightly in Bucharest. Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romania's leader, framed the campaign as one of national redemption. The German High Command welcomed Romania's involvement, as its forces would provide a substantial contribution along the southern sector of the Eastern Front. In total, more than 25,000 Romanian soldiers were mobilized, supported by around 40 divisions of the Wehrmacht advancing through the same front. Facing them was the Soviet Ninth Army under General Yakov Cherevichenko, numbering approximately 2,000 men. These forces had established defensive positions along the Prut River, attempting to block crossings and prevent the Axis armies from entering deep into Moldavia and toward the Dniester line. The Prut line was not merely a military frontier, it was the site of complex political tensions. For the Soviet Union, retaining Bessarabia was part of the broader security buffer that Stalin had built along the western frontier after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For Romania, its loss symbolized weakness and the dangers of isolation in a Europe dominated by great powers. For Germany, the southern flank of Operation Barbarossa offered not only strategic depth, but also vital economic prizes: the oil fields of Romania, essential for sustaining the Axis war machine, and the agricultural resources of southern Ukraine. Thus, the battles that erupted along the Prut in June 1941 were shaped by overlapping agendas: Romanian nationalism, Soviet defense, and German expansionism. Military preparations on both sides reflected differing levels of readiness. Romanian divisions were numerous but unevenly equipped. Many units relied on outdated artillery, limited mechanization, and conscripts with only basic training. By contrast, the Wehrmacht formations alongside them, such as elements of the 11th Army, brought modern equipment, experienced staff officers, and coordinated air support from Luftwaffe. On the Soviet side, the 9th Army possessed large quantities of material, including tanks of mixed quality such as T-26s and BT-7s. But many formations were under strength, and communication between higher command and frontline units was inconsistent. The purges of the late 1930s had also removed many experienced commanders, leaving younger officers to face a sudden and large-scale war. The geography of the Prut River Valley itself posed challenges. The river, though not as wide or formidable as the Dniester or Dnieper, created a natural obstacle for advancing armies. The banks were marshy in many places, with limited crossing points suitable for vehicles. Bridges, both road and rail, became critical targets. Soviet engineers prepared demolitions, while Romanian and German staffs planned simultaneous crossings to overwhelm defenses before demolitions could be carried out. The terrain on both sides was rural, marked by small villages, rolling hills, and farmland, where the local population had mixed loyalties. Some communities, particularly ethnic Romanians, viewed the Axis advance as liberation, while others, especially minorities who had benefited under Soviet rule, anticipated repression and upheaval. Public sentiment in Romania was heavily shaped by propaganda. Official statements emphasized the campaign as a war of recovery rather than conquest. Posters, speeches, and newspapers declared that the Romanian army was returning home to Bessarabia. In Germany, the advance was integrated into the larger narrative of Barbarossa, presented as a decisive strike against Bolshevism. On the Soviet side, official communications framed the defense of Bessarabia as part of the wider struggle to repel fascist invasion. Civilians in the contested zones found themselves caught between these narratives, facing conscription, requisitioning of food and livestock, and the threat of bombardment. Intelligence assessments shaped the initial deployments. German and Romanian commanders believed the Soviet defense to be brittle, expecting rapid withdrawal once the offensive began. Soviet leadership, conversely, underestimated the scale of the Axis commitment along the Prut, assuming Romania's forces would act mainly in a supporting role to the Wehrmacht, rather than leading major assaults. This miscalculation would have significant consequences once operations commenced. Both sides expected a short, decisive confrontation. Neither anticipated the extent of resistance and the heavy casualties that would mark the first weeks of fighting along the river. As dawn broke on 22nd of June 1941, artillery batteries along the Prut opened fire, beginning a series of battles that would rage across the river valley for weeks. The guns of both the Romanian and German armies thundered against Soviet positions, while Soviet counter-barrages lit the sky in reply. What unfolded was not a quick liberation, nor an easy defense, but a protracted and bloody struggle that revealed the full weight of the Eastern Front's southern sector. For the soldiers of all nations involved, the Prut would soon become synonymous with sacrifice, uncertainty, and the collision of great power ambitions played out in the villages and fields of Bessarabia. The opening phase of the fighting along the Prut unfolded with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. On the morning of 22nd June 1941, Axis artillery began systematic bombardments aimed at Soviet positions on the eastern bank. Romanian gunners, using batteries positioned near Iași, Huși, and Ungheni, unleashed heavy fire designed to silence bunkers and disrupt communication lines. German units of the 11th Army contributed with longer-range guns and Stuka dive bombers, which sought to neutralize Soviet strongpoints and prevent the demolition of bridges. For the Axis command, the objective was clear: secure crossings rapidly before the Soviet 9th Army could mount an organized defense. The Soviet response was immediate and fierce. Pre-positioned along the Prut were several fortified sectors manned by rifle divisions of the 35th Rifle Corps and elements of mechanized units pulled back from Bessarabia after the outbreak of hostilities. Machine gun nests, trench networks, and artillery pieces placed on elevated ground provided overlapping fields of fire against attempted crossings. Soviet engineers destroyed several key bridges during the first hours of battle, including those near Leova and Sculeni, forcing Axis forces to rely on pontoon construction and improvised ferries. The intensity of Soviet resistance surprised many Romanian units, which had expected swifter withdrawals. Command structures played a decisive role in these early engagements. On the Romanian side, the 3rd Army under General Petre Dumitrescu and the 4th Army under General Nicolae Țiupercă were tasked with leading the main assault. Their divisions, often supported by German detachments, carried out frontal attacks along multiple sectors of the river. Coordination, however, was uneven. While German staff officers maintained strict timetables, Romanian units, less experienced in combined arms warfare, sometimes lagged behind or suffered delays in bridging operations. Soviet commanders under General Cherevichenko exploited these delays by directing concentrated artillery fire against pontoon bridges as they were being laid, resulting in high losses and repeated rebuilding efforts. Air operations became a defining feature of the opening phase. The Romanian Air Force, consisting of around 600 aircraft, supported ground troops with reconnaissance and strafing runs, while the German Luftwaffe's Stukas carried out precision strikes against Soviet artillery. Despite this, the Soviet VVS deployed fighters such as the I-16 and bombers, including the SB-2, to contest air superiority. Dogfights erupted across the skies above the Prut Valley, with both sides claiming victories. The struggle for air control directly influenced the tempo of the river battles, as whichever side held the skies could more effectively support or disrupt bridging efforts. Civilian populations in the border regions found themselves in the crossfire. Villages along the Prut were shelled indiscriminately as Axis forces attempted to dislodge Soviet defenders. Families fled into forests or hid in cellars, while others were pressed into service as guides for advancing troops. Reports from both sides mention confusion, with civilians unsure whether to welcome Romanian soldiers as liberators or fear reprisals. The rapid shifts in control over certain villages created an atmosphere of instability, leaving inhabitants exposed to requisitions and suspicion from whichever army held the ground at the moment. Despite intense artillery preparation, Axis progress during the first days was slower than anticipated. On 23 and 24 June, repeated attempts to cross at key points such as Sculeni and Ungheni met with heavy Soviet fire, inflicting casualties and forcing temporary withdrawals. German observers noted that Romanian infantry, though motivated, lacked the heavy armor support that might have overwhelmed the Soviet defenses more quickly. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders ordered counterattacks by mechanized units, including detachments equipped with light tanks. These counterattacks, though costly and often disorganized, succeeded in delaying Axis consolidation on the eastern bank. The morale of soldiers during these early engagements reflected the uncertainty of the campaign. Romanian troops, many of them conscripts from rural backgrounds, entered battle with the conviction that they were reclaiming lost provinces. Yet the reality of facing entrenched Soviet firepower and suffering mounting losses tempered this enthusiasm. On the Soviet side, defenders fought under orders emphasizing the need to hold every position, while propaganda framed their struggle as a defense of socialism against invasion. The immediate motivation was survival and the defense of their comrades. Both sides experienced moments of courage and confusion, shaped by the chaos of large-scale river combat. By the final days of June, the situation along the Prut remained contested. Axis forces had secured several bridgeheads, often at significant cost, while Soviet troops clung to defensive positions further east. Neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough, and the fighting had already taken on the characteristics of a drawn-out struggle rather than the rapid advance predicted in German plans. The stage was set for an escalation of operations, as reinforcements arrived and both armies prepared for more determined efforts to dominate the river crossings and open the way into Bessarabia. The strategic goals that guided the fighting along the Prut reflected the divergent priorities of the Axis and Soviet commands. For Romania, participation in Operation Barbarossa was framed above all as a war of recovery. The official Romanian objective was the reconquest of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, lost in June 1940 following the Soviet ultimatum. Marshal Ion Antonescu repeatedly stressed to both his generals and the public that Romania would not advance beyond the Dniester, seeking to present the war as limited and defensive in nature. Nevertheless, German influence steadily drew Romanian forces into a broader framework, linking their operations to the wider objectives of the Wehrmacht's Army Group South. While Romanian propaganda emphasized national redemption, German staff viewed the Romanian armies as auxiliaries, whose mission extended beyond the Prut into Ukraine once Bessarabia was retaken. German strategic interests were more expansive. The Wehrmacht's southern sector was tasked with advancing deep into Soviet territory to secure the Ukrainian heartland and link up with Army Group Center further north. The 11th Army under General Eugen von Schobert was positioned to cooperate with Romanian armies in forcing the Prut and driving east toward the Dniester and Odessa. The Germans sought to prevent the Soviet 9th Army from organizing a coherent defense along the river valleys. In addition, German planners viewed Romanian oil fields at Ploiești as indispensable, and thus saw Romania's active engagement on the front as a way to tie its political loyalty to Berlin. Strategic planning thus combined ideological objectives with concrete military needs, binding the two allies in a partnership shaped by mutual dependence but unequal capacity. On the Soviet side, strategic goals were shaped by the suddenness of the German invasion. The Southwestern Front, under General Mikhail Kirponos, was responsible for the defense of Bessarabia and the approaches to the Black Sea. Within this structure, the 9th Army under General Cherevichenko was positioned along the Prut as the immediate shield against Axis incursions. Soviet plans had not anticipated such a rapid offensive in the south. Prior to June 1941, defensive works along the Prut had been rudimentary compared to those on the western frontier near Brest or Minsk. Nevertheless, the Soviet command understood the importance of holding Bessarabia. Losing it would not only cede territory, but also open the gateway toward the Dniester and the approaches to Odessa. Orders from Moscow emphasized delaying actions and buying time for reserves to mobilize from deeper within the Soviet Union. Logistics became a defining challenge. The Axis armies massed along the Prut required enormous amounts of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, and bridging equipment. Romania's infrastructure was not fully prepared for the scale of the operation. Roads leading to the river were often unpaved, and the movement of heavy artillery and tanks caused congestion. German supply officers recorded frequent delays in getting fuel to forward units. Romanian divisions, which relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, struggled even more with mobility. Pontoon bridging equipment, vital for crossing the Prut, had to be shared between Romanian and German units, slowing operations. On the Soviet side, supply lines ran eastward toward Odessa and the interior of Ukraine. While the Red Army had stockpiles in Bessarabia, the chaos of the opening days meant that many supplies were abandoned or destroyed during withdrawals. Soviet logistics were further hampered by Axis airstrikes on rail junctions and depots. Military doctrines also shaped the course of the campaign. The German Wehrmacht emphasized rapid combined arms operations, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support to achieve breakthroughs. Romanian divisions, though large in number, were trained in more traditional infantry tactics, relying on frontal assaults with limited mechanization. This doctrinal gap created difficulties in coordination. German officers often complained about Romanian hesitancy in exploiting breaches, while Romanian commanders noted that their troops lacked the equipment necessary for deeper maneuvers. The Soviet doctrine of defense in depth, meanwhile, was imperfectly applied. Soviet forces attempted to hold fortified lines directly on the Prut, often absorbing heavy casualties under Axis artillery, rather than conducting flexible withdrawals. Yet in some sectors, Soviet counterattacks demonstrated elements of their operational doctrine, aiming to blunt Axis momentum by localized offensives with tanks and mechanized infantry. Propaganda on all sides reflected these strategic objectives. Romanian newspapers depicted the offensive as a crusade to liberate Bessarabia, printing maps and photographs of soldiers crossing the Prut. German propaganda highlighted Romanian cooperation as evidence of a united front against Bolshevism, downplaying the unequal nature of the alliance. Soviet broadcasts and leaflets portrayed the Romanian soldiers as pawns of German imperialism, urging them to surrender and avoid fighting brother Slavs. This psychological warfare had limited immediate effect, but it illustrates how strategy was waged not only with weapons, but also with competing narratives designed to influence morale. Intelligence assessments during this phase were uneven. Romanian intelligence services reported that Soviet forces were demoralized and would retreat quickly once the offensive began. These estimates underestimated the determination of Soviet defenders along the river. German intelligence similarly assumed that the Ninth Army was weaker than it proved to be. Soviet intelligence, for its part, had received warnings of the impending invasion, but failed to concentrate sufficient forces in Bessarabia to mount a strong defense. The result was a misalignment of expectations. The Axis believed in a rapid breakthrough, while the Soviets anticipated a slower, more limited offensive. The reality of protracted and bloody fighting along the Prut revealed how both sides misjudged the enemy's resolve. By late June, strategic planning had already begun to diverge from battlefield realities. The Romanian armies had committed themselves to heavy assaults across the river, sustaining significant losses in the process. German commanders pressed them to continue advancing, pointing to the necessity of keeping pace with the broader progress of Army Group South. Soviet High Command, meanwhile, issued directives to conduct elastic defense and gradual withdrawal toward the Dniester, recognizing that Bessarabia could not be held indefinitely. The stage was set for an intensification of combat, as strategy collided with the realities of terrain, supply, and resistance. The first major clashes along the Prut highlighted both the determination of the attackers and the resilience of the defenders. After the initial bombardments of 22nd June, Romanian infantry divisions began advancing toward the river crossings. At Sculeni, the 14th Infantry Division attempted a direct assault supported by German artillery and Stuka dive bombers. The crossing began with small detachments rowing across in boats, followed by engineers constructing pontoon bridges. Soviet defenders of the 176th Rifle Division had prepared interlocking fields of fire and opened up with machine guns and mortars as soon as the first rafts touched the eastern bank. Casualties mounted quickly. forcing Romanian units to take cover on the western side until Luftwaffe airstrikes silenced several strongpoints. Only by the evening of 23rd June was a shallow bridgehead secured, and even then it was precarious under constant Soviet shelling. Similar struggles unfolded at Ungheni, where the 35th Infantry Division sought to establish a crossing. Here, Soviet forces demolished the permanent bridge in the opening hours of battle, leaving Romanian engineers to work under fire to build pontoons. Several attempts failed when artillery rounds shattered the bridging equipment. German reinforcements, including elements of the 170th Infantry Division, were brought forward to support the crossing. After 2 days of bitter fighting, a tenuous foothold was established, but the cost in men and material far exceeded Romanian pre-war expectations. These engagements demonstrated that the Soviet Ninth Army was not disintegrating, but fighting a disciplined, if costly, defense. The clashes were not limited to riverbanks. Soviet forces launched counterattacks against bridgeheads with small groups of tanks, often BT-7s or T-26s accompanied by infantry. Although technically outdated compared to German Panzer IIIs and IVs, these tanks were effective in the narrow confines of the bridgehead battles. On 24th of June, a counterattack near Sculeni temporarily drove Romanian troops back to the waterline before being repelled by concentrated artillery fire and Luftwaffe intervention. These engagements underscored the Soviet capacity to mount local offensives, despite suffering from broader strategic surprise. Civilians were drawn directly into the battles as villages near the crossings became contested ground. At Leova, Axis artillery bombardments flattened several streets, forcing inhabitants to flee into the countryside. In many cases, villagers found themselves caught between shifting lines. Soviet authorities attempted to evacuate livestock and food supplies eastward, but much was abandoned in the chaos. Romanian troops, upon occupying settlements, requisitioned supplies to sustain their advance, while German units systematically searched for intelligence and fuel. Civilians often faced suspicion of collaboration, whichever side held control, making daily survival precarious. Morale among Romanian troops during these early clashes was complex. Soldiers entered combat with the belief that they were liberating national territory, yet the intensity of Soviet resistance and the scale of casualties shocked many. Letters later intercepted by censors reveal frustration at inadequate equipment and the difficulty of crossing under artillery fire. German officers expressed mixed evaluations of their allies, impressed by their endurance but critical of their tactical inexperience. On the Soviet side, morale was shaped by a sense of defending homeland soil. Political commissars played an active role, ensuring that retreat without orders was punished and exhorting soldiers to resist at all costs. Reports from the Soviet Ninth Army indicate that even under heavy bombardment, rifle divisions maintained cohesion and discipline. Air operations intensified, as both sides recognized the importance of controlling the skies. The Romanian Air Force flew dozens of sorties daily, attacking Soviet artillery positions and attempting to disrupt supply lines. However, losses mounted from Soviet fighters of the 20th Mixed Aviation Division, which defended Odessa and Bessarabia. German Stukas proved decisive in breaking up Soviet concentrations during counterattacks, though at the cost of several aircraft lost to anti-aircraft fire. Control of the air remained contested, with each side able to claim local superiority at different points along the front. Casualty figures from the first week illustrate the ferocity of these engagements. Romanian sources recorded thousands of losses during the attempts to force the river, with some divisions losing up to 10% of their strength in a matter of days. German units, though more experienced, also suffered from Soviet artillery strikes on pontoon bridges. Soviet losses were equally heavy, as rifle divisions bore the brunt of Axis artillery and air bombardment. Entire battalions were reduced to fragments, forcing commanders to consolidate units in order to maintain a continuous line. The Prut thus quickly became a costly battleground for both sides, far from the expectations of a swift breakthrough. By the end of June, the first engagements had created a series of unstable bridgeheads along the Prut. Axis forces had managed to gain footholds, but none were secure enough to permit a rapid advance eastward. Soviet defenders, though battered, continued to contest every crossing and launched local counterattacks to keep the attackers off balance. The opening phase revealed that the campaign would not be a simple march of recovery, but a prolonged confrontation in which both sides would commit large numbers of men and resources. The Prut River battles, far from being a sideshow to the broader Barbarossa offensive, were proving central to the struggle for control of Bessarabia. The escalation of the campaign along the Prut River unfolded as June gave way to July 1941. What had begun as a series of contested crossings quickly developed into a broader struggle that absorbed reinforcements and intensified casualties. Romanian and German commands recognized that securing only small, unstable bridgeheads would not be sufficient. Their strategic imperative was to break the Soviet line completely, forcing a retreat toward the Dniester. Conversely, Soviet leadership understood that if the Prut line collapsed too quickly, Bessarabia as a whole would be lost, leaving Odessa and the approaches to the Black Sea dangerously exposed. The result was a spiral of reinforcement and counter-reinforcement that turned the Prut Valley into a major theater of combat. On the Axis side, additional Romanian divisions were brought forward, including fresh formations from the 4th Army. The 1st Armored Division, though relatively small and equipped with a mixture of R2 tanks, licensed Czech-built models, and older French vehicles, was ordered to prepare for exploitation once crossings were secure. German assistance remained critical. The 11th Army provided both operational coordination and heavy artillery to strengthen assaults on fortified Soviet positions. Axis logistics also adapted to the growing intensity of the battle. Pontoon bridging units worked around the clock to repair and expand crossing sites, often under direct fire. Supply columns carrying ammunition and rations jammed the roads leading to the front, while Romanian peasants were pressed into service with horse carts to carry loads where motor transport could not pass. The Soviet response was to harden the defense of Bessarabia by deploying reserves from the interior. Elements of the 18th and 48th Rifle Divisions were rushed to reinforce collapsing sectors. Soviet mechanized units, though suffering from fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns, launched repeated counterattacks against newly established Axis bridgeheads. One notable engagement occurred near Leova at the end of June, when a Soviet armored detachment with approximately 40 tanks attacked a Romanian infantry regiment holding a shallow bridgehead. Despite inflicting heavy casualties and temporarily pushing the defenders back to the river's edge, the assault was broken by concentrated German airstrikes. Such clashes revealed the high cost of Soviet attempts to contest every sector, but they also slowed Axis consolidation. Terrain and weather added further complications. The Prut Valley's marshes and summer rains turned many areas into muddy quagmires, hampering mobility. Axis vehicles frequently bogged down near crossing points, delaying artillery support for infantry advances. Soviet forces exploited the terrain, laying mines and constructing hidden defensive positions that made frontal attacks costly. In some cases, forests and orchards along the river concealed Soviet troops who launched sudden ambushes against advancing Romanian infantry. The geography thus amplified the difficulties of an already complex campaign, transforming what might have been straightforward crossings into drawn-out contests of attrition. Political pressures further escalated the fighting. Marshal Antonescu pushed his generals to maintain offensive momentum, wary of appearing hesitant before German allies. For Hitler, the southern front needed to advance in step with the broader Operation Barbarossa timetable. Delays along the Prut threatened to unbalance Army Group South's advance into Ukraine. This political urgency translated into military orders that demanded repeated assaults even after previous failures. Romanian commanders often had to throw their divisions into renewed attacks with little rest, compounding fatigue and casualties. On the Soviet side, Stalin's directives forbade large-scale withdrawals without authorization, compelling the Ninth Army to cling to positions even when encirclement threatened. Commanders who suggested retreat risked punishment, reinforcing a cycle of resistance at any cost. The civilian population endured increasingly harsh conditions during this escalation. Many villages were shelled multiple times as control shifted back and forth. Fields were trampled by troops and vehicles, disrupting harvests and creating food shortages. Soviet authorities organized partial evacuations eastward, while Romanian propaganda teams entered recaptured settlements, distributing leaflets declaring that the liberators had returned. Civilians were caught between requisitions from both armies, with livestock, carts, and grain seized to support military needs. Rumors of reprisals spread widely, as both sides suspected villagers of collaboration with the enemy. For the population, the escalation meant constant insecurity and the destruction of livelihoods. By early July, casualty figures on both sides reflected the intensification of the campaign. Romanian divisions reported thousands of losses in killed, wounded, and missing. Some units, particularly those engaged in repeated assaults at Sculeni and Ungheni, were reduced to half their effective strength. German formations, though more resilient, also suffered significant losses from Soviet artillery fire. Soviet casualties were even heavier, with entire rifle regiments decimated by bombardments and airstrikes. The Red Army compensated by throwing fresh formations into the line, but the cumulative effect of losses eroded cohesion. Medical facilities on both sides were overwhelmed, and improvised field hospitals filled villages near the front with wounded soldiers. Internationally, the escalation of fighting along the Prut drew attention from both Axis and Allied observers. In Berlin, Romanian participation was praised as evidence of loyalty, though German staff privately noted the disproportionate losses suffered by their allies. In London and Moscow, propaganda highlighted Romanian involvement as proof that Hitler had dragged smaller nations into a destructive war. Diplomats in neutral capitals monitored reports of the battle, recognizing that the fate of Bessarabia would influence not only the Axis campaign in the south, but also the morale of the countries aligned with Germany. The crisis phase of the Prut battles thus revealed the convergence of multiple pressures: military urgency, political expectations, and the relentless demands of geography and logistics. The fighting had escalated far beyond the initial expectations of both Romanian and German planners. Instead of a rapid crossing, the Prut had become the site of a grinding campaign in which Soviet defenders absorbed enormous punishment while buying time for the wider Red Army to regroup. The river that many had expected to be a temporary obstacle was proving to be a line of crisis, shaping the course of the Southern Front in the first weeks of the war. The peak of the campaign along the Prut River came in the first half of July 1941, when the heaviest fighting coincided with decisive attempts by the Axis to secure Bessarabia and by the Soviet command to hold it. After 2 weeks of attritional clashes, both sides concentrated their forces for larger operations, hoping to tip the balance. For the Axis, this meant coordinating Romanian and German divisions into sustained assaults designed to expand bridgeheads into full-scale breakthroughs. For the Soviets, it meant reinforcing the Ninth Army with new units from the interior and launching counteroffensives to push the enemy back across the river. By 5th of July, Romanian forces had already suffered significant casualties, but German commanders pressed for a renewed effort. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies were ordered to attack along a broad front from Sculeni to Leova. Heavy artillery preparations preceded these assaults, with German batteries supplementing the Romanian guns. Luftwaffe squadrons flew hundreds of sorties, concentrating on Soviet artillery positions and troop concentrations. The Romanian Air Force, though smaller in scale, contributed bombing runs against secondary targets. On the ground, entire divisions were committed to storming entrenched Soviet positions. The fighting was marked by ferocious resistance as Soviet rifle units, supported by anti-tank guns and mortars, forced attackers to engage in costly close-quarters combat. In many villages, battles raged street by street, with neither side willing to retreat. One of the largest engagements occurred near Chițcani and Stoianovca, where the Axis sought to expand their bridgehead south of Ungheni. Several Romanian divisions, supported by German armor, pushed against the Soviet 95th Rifle Division. The combat lasted for days, with repeated charges across open ground under artillery fire. Romanian officers reported battalions reduced to half strength in a single afternoon. Yet the persistence of the assaults gradually eroded Soviet lines, which were weakened by heavy casualties and shortages of ammunition. By 8th of July, the Axis succeeded in linking bridgeheads into a continuous front east of the Prut, creating the conditions for further advance into central Bessarabia. Soviet counteroffensives reached their peak at the same time, On 7 and 9 July, Soviet mechanized brigades, including detachments with T-34 and KV-1 tanks newly arriving at the front, launched counterattacks against Axis footholds near Sculeni. These were among the first occasions Romanian troops encountered the new generation of Soviet heavy armor. The effect was dramatic. Romanian anti-tank guns, mostly 37mm models, proved ineffective against the thicker armor of the T-34s. Panic spread among frontline units until German 88mm flak guns were brought forward to blunt the assault. The encounter underscored the qualitative disparity between Soviet armored technology and Romanian equipment, even if poor coordination limited the overall effectiveness of the counterattack. Despite local successes, Soviet armored thrusts were isolated and ultimately repelled by superior Axis air power and concentrated artillery. The impact on morale was considerable. Romanian soldiers experienced both fear and admiration when facing the new Soviet tanks, while German units grew more convinced of the need to modernize their allies' arsenal. For Soviet troops, the counteroffensives demonstrated that even under heavy bombardment, they could disrupt the enemy's advance. Yet the cost was devastating. Dozens of tanks destroyed, infantry formations shattered, and commanders struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of constant Axis pressure. Civilian suffering reached new levels during this peak phase. Villages caught in the center of battle were devastated by artillery exchanges, with entire communities reduced to ruins. Refugees fled eastward, crowding roads already filled with retreating Soviet units. Romanian authorities, once they occupied settlements, attempted to restore basic administration, but were immediately confronted with shortages of food and housing. German units, focused on military priorities, requisitioned supplies without regard for local needs. The civilian population thus endured bombardment, displacement, and scarcity, all while uncertain of how long front lines would remain stable. At the operational level, Axis successes became more pronounced after 10th of July. With the expansion of bridgeheads and the gradual weakening of Soviet defenses, the Prut ceased to be a meaningful barrier. Axis forces pushed eastward, targeting key towns such as Balts and Chișinău. German staff emphasized speed, urging Romanian armies to advance in step with their operations further north. Nevertheless, progress remained slower than in other sectors of Operation Barbarossa, a reflection of the tenacity of Soviet defense and the limitations of Romanian capabilities. The High Command in Berlin noted the discrepancy but continued to rely on Romanian manpower to maintain pressure on the southern flank. Casualty figures during this peak were staggering compared to earlier weeks. Some Romanian divisions lost more than a quarter of their initial strength, with regiments reporting fewer than half of their companies still combat capable. German losses, though lighter, included significant numbers of officers, a strain on command effectiveness. Soviet losses were even heavier, with thousands killed or captured in the localized encirclements. Entire rifle regiments ceased to exist as coherent units. Yet the Red Army's willingness to throw fresh divisions into the fight meant that the Axis still faced organized opposition, even as the defense became increasingly desperate. International observers noted the scale of the battles. Reports from Berlin highlighted Romanian heroism and framed the campaign as proof of Axis unity. In Moscow, Soviet propaganda portrayed the defense of Bessarabia as part of the larger Great Patriotic War, emphasizing sacrifice and the eventual inevitability of victory. Allied governments in London and Washington followed these developments with concern, recognizing that the southern sector's outcome would influence the stability of the Black Sea and the security of Soviet supply routes. By mid-July, the Prut battles had reached their climax. Axis forces had finally secured decisive footholds and begun advancing deeper into Bessarabia, while Soviet defenders, though battered, had demonstrated their capacity to delay and inflict severe losses. The campaign was entering a new stage, moving from the river line into the contested heart of the province. For soldiers and civilians alike, the peak of the Prut battles had left indelible scars, shaping the character of the campaign and setting the stage for the decisive struggles that would follow. As the fighting pushed deeper into Bessarabia in the second half of July 1941, the character of the campaign began to shift from frontal assaults across the Prut to a series of resistance and adaptation measures on both sides. The initial shock of the invasion had passed, but the struggle remained fluid. Soviet commanders sought to prolong the defense, using delaying tactics to cover withdrawals, while Romanian and German forces attempted to consolidate gains and prepare for further advances toward the Dniester. This stage revealed the capacity of each side to adapt to mounting losses, logistical challenges, and the psychological toll of continuous combat. For the Romanian army, adaptation meant integrating more closely with German operational methods. Units that had suffered heavy casualties during the initial crossings were reorganized, with battalions merged and officers reassigned. German liaison officers were placed within Romanian headquarters to improve coordination, especially in artillery and air support. Romanian commanders began to rely more heavily on combined operations, requesting German armor and Luftwaffe strikes to precede infantry attacks. This adjustment reduced the tempo of operations but increased their effectiveness, ensuring that new offensives did not collapse under Soviet counterfire as they had in late June. Romanian troops also demonstrated tactical innovation at the small unit level. Engineers improved the efficiency of pontoon bridge construction, developing methods to camouflage crossing sites from Soviet aerial reconnaissance. Infantry platoons learned to advance in smaller groups to minimize losses from artillery barrages, and field reports indicate a growing reliance on captured Soviet weapons, particularly machine guns and mortars, to compensate for shortages. These adaptations reflected the steep learning curve forced upon the Romanian army, which had not previously fought such intense modern warfare on this scale. On the Soviet side, resistance took multiple forms. Regular army units, though battered, continued to fight delaying actions, retreating in stages while inflicting maximum damage. Ambushes became common, with small detachments using the cover of forests and villages to harass Axis columns. Soviet commanders made extensive use of scorched earth tactics, destroying rail lines, burning crops, and evacuating livestock to deny resources to the advancing enemy. These measures slowed Axis supply efforts and created food shortages in newly occupied areas. In addition, partisan activity began to emerge behind the front lines. Though still limited in scale in Bessarabia, small groups of local communists and retreating soldiers carried out sabotage against bridges and communication lines, marking the beginning of a resistance movement that would expand in later years. Civilian populations were drawn into these adaptation processes. In Axis-controlled areas, Romanian authorities attempted to re-establish administration, appointing local officials and reintroducing Romanian language and symbols. Propaganda teams emphasized that Bessarabia had returned to the Romanian state, while promising protection of property and religious freedoms. Yet reality was harsher. Requisitioning of grain and livestock intensified, and suspicion of Soviet sympathies led to arrests and deportations. For civilians remaining under Soviet control, evacuation and destruction orders caused widespread hardship. Families abandoned homes under pressure from retreating troops, often leaving with little more than what they could carry. The constant movement of populations, combined with bombardments, created humanitarian crises that both sides largely ignored in pursuit of military goals. Psychologically, the toll on soldiers was increasingly evident. Romanian diaries and reports mention exhaustion from weeks of continuous fighting, with many soldiers writing that they had expected a swift campaign, but instead found themselves engaged in grinding battles with high casualties. German officers noted growing signs of fatigue among their allies, though they also praised their determination to press forward despite losses. Soviet accounts described the strain of retreat, where soldiers often fought with the knowledge that falling back could mean accusations of cowardice. Commissars enforced discipline strictly, sometimes executing those who retreated without orders. Yet morale was sustained by the belief that they were defending their homeland and that reinforcements from the Soviet interior would eventually arrive. Resource management became another arena of adaptation. Axis logistics had been stretched to the limit during the Prut battles, and supply shortages threatened to stall the advance. In response, German staff established supply depots in captured towns and repaired bridges to reopen transport routes. Romanian authorities mobilized local peasants to transport goods with carts, easing the burden on motorized units. Soviet defenders, by contrast, deliberately targeted these supply routes with artillery and sabotage. Several convoys were ambushed in July, forcing Axis forces to dedicate troops to guarding their rear areas. This further illustrated how the campaign was not only decided at the front line, but also in the struggle to sustain forces across a devastated landscape. Resistance was also political. In Moscow, Soviet propaganda began framing the Prut battles as examples of heroic sacrifice, emphasizing stories of small units holding off larger Axis formations. These narratives sought to counterbalance the grim reality of retreat with a sense of eventual triumph. In Bucharest, Antonescu used public speeches to claim victory, even as losses mounted, insisting that Romania was fulfilling its historic mission. Both governments relied on these narratives to maintain public support, demonstrating how resistance and adaptation were not only military, but also ideological. By the third week of July, it was clear that the Prut line had been breached and that the battle was shifting into central Bessarabia. Yet the campaign was far from over. The Soviet Ninth Army continued to fight delaying battles, while Romanian and German forces adapted to sustain their advance. Each side had demonstrated resilience under immense pressure. The battles were no longer simply about river crossings, but about the ability to endure and improvise in the face of mounting losses. Resistance and adaptation defined this stage of the conflict, ensuring that the campaign retained its intensity even as the geographical focus moved eastward toward the Dniester. By the final weeks of July 1941, the battles along the Prut had shifted into what became the turning point of the campaign. The initial Soviet resistance, though fierce, had been steadily eroded by attrition, while the Axis bridgeheads gradually expanded into a continuous front across Bessarabia. What began as a contested river struggle now transformed into a broader maneuver campaign, with both sides seeking to determine whether the Soviet Ninth Army could maintain its cohesion or whether the Axis would achieve the decisive breakthrough needed to carry the front to the Dniester. The Axis High Command pressed for a decisive push. By mid-July, German and Romanian forces coordinated a series of converging attacks, aimed at cutting Soviet defensive lines into isolated pockets. The Romanian Fourth Army advanced toward Chișinău from the south, while the Third Army drove northeast from Iași. German units of the 11th Army provided critical armored and air support, spearheading assaults designed to bypass strongpoints rather than confront them directly. These operations demonstrated the adaptation of earlier lessons. Instead of costly frontal crossings, Axis commanders now sought encirclements to force Soviet withdrawals. For the Soviet command, the situation was dire but not hopeless. Reinforcements, including elements of the 2nd Mechanized Corps, were committed to halt the Axis momentum. Several counterattacks were launched near Balci and Orhei, designed to cut Axis spearheads off from their bridging zones. Yet these efforts, though courageous, suffered from poor coordination and limited fuel supplies. Tank brigades often arrived piecemeal, allowing Axis artillery and dive bombers to concentrate firepower on each formation in turn. By 20th of July, most Soviet counteroffensives had been repelled with heavy losses, weakening the Ninth Army's ability to hold a coherent line. The critical turning point came with the fall of Chișinău on 16th or 17th of July. The city, the administrative center of Bessarabia, had been fortified as a stronghold by Soviet forces, with defensive belts and barricades across major approaches. Axis assaults, combining German artillery and Romanian infantry, wore down the defenders over several days of close combat. Street fighting erupted, with Soviet units attempting to delay the Axis advance while evacuations were carried out. When the Axis finally took the city, the capture marked both a symbolic and operational breakthrough. The Soviet defense of central Bessarabia had collapsed, and the Axis now had a direct route toward the Dniester crossings. Civilian consequences of this turning point were profound. In Chișinău, large sections of the population fled eastward with retreating Soviet forces, while those who remained faced the re-establishment of Romanian administration. Propaganda immediately declared the city liberated, while officials began reinstating Romanian institutions. Yet destruction from bombardments, food shortages, and arrests of suspected collaborators created an atmosphere of fear. Across rural areas, the constant movement of armies left villages in ruins, while partisan groups began to form in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal, planting the seeds of continued resistance behind Axis lines. The Axis breakthrough had strategic consequences for the entire southern front. With Bessarabia effectively lost, the Soviet Ninth Army fell back toward the Dniester, abandoning positions that had cost thousands of lives to defend. The retreat was chaotic in many sectors, with units cut off and forced to surrender. Romanian and German forces claimed tens of thousands of prisoners of war in encirclements, though this success came at the cost of severe Romanian casualties. Divisions that had begun the campaign at full strength were now shadows of their original size, with battalions reduced to companies and officers struggling to keep formations intact. For the Soviets, the collapse of the Prut defense was interpreted as both a disaster and a rallying call. Official orders emphasized the need to hold the Dniester line at all costs, framing the loss of Bessarabia as temporary. Soviet propaganda highlighted stories of resistance during the Chișinău battles, portraying them as examples of sacrifice that would eventually inspire revenge. Yet privately, Soviet commanders recognized that the turning point had shifted momentum firmly in favor of the Axis. The defense of Bessarabia could no longer be sustained. The priority now was to preserve forces for future battles deeper inside Ukraine. Internationally, news of the breakthrough was met with mixed reactions. Axis media celebrated the recapture of Bessarabia as a triumph of Romanian arms and as proof of the effectiveness of German-led coalition warfare. In London, analysts noted the implications for Soviet access to the Black Sea and worried about the stability of Soviet southern defenses. In Washington, reports emphasized the scale of the Axis advance, but also highlighted Soviet resilience in other sectors, stressing that the Red Army was far from defeated. By the end of July, the turning point of the Prut battles was clear. The Axis had achieved their immediate goal of crossing the river and breaking Soviet resistance in Bessarabia, securing Chișinău, and driving the enemy toward the Dniester. The Soviet Ninth Army, though battered, remained in existence, retreating eastward to regroup. For both sides, the battles had demonstrated the enormous human and material cost of the campaign. The turning of momentum in favor of the Axis did not end the struggle, but it transformed its scale and direction, setting the stage for the final confrontations along the Dniester and the broader southern sector of the Eastern Front. The aftermath of the turning point in Bessarabia unfolded rapidly in late July and early August 1941. Once Chișinău had fallen and the Soviet Ninth Army was compelled to abandon its defensive lines, the battles shifted toward the Dniester River. The Soviet retreat, though partly organized, soon degenerated into a series of chaotic withdrawals. Entire formations fell back without adequate supply, pursued relentlessly by Romanian and German forces determined to consolidate their gains. The campaign, which had begun with contested crossings of the Prut, now entered its concluding stage marked by retreats, encirclements, and the establishment of occupation regimes. For the Axis, the immediate military objective was clear: secure the Dniester line to stabilize the front and open the way toward Odessa. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies pushed eastward, their divisions spread thin after weeks of combat. German units provided critical reinforcement, especially in mobile operations, as Romanian forces lacked sufficient armor to maintain pressure on the retreating Soviets. Axis troops captured Balti and Soroka, further fragmenting Soviet defenses. In many areas, Soviet units fought brief delaying battles before withdrawing further east, buying time for the evacuation of men and material across the Dniester. Yet, in several pockets, retreating units were cut off. Thousands of prisoners were taken, adding to the already staggering Soviet losses in manpower. The Soviet retreat was accompanied by large-scale destruction. Following orders from Moscow, retreating forces carried out scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure to deny resources to the Axis. Bridges were blown, railways dismantled, and grain stores set on fire. The Dniester became the final natural defensive barrier in the region, and Soviet engineers worked urgently to fortify crossings and prepare fallback positions. Yet the speed of the Axis advance limited the effectiveness of these measures. By early August, Romanian patrols had already reached the river in multiple sectors, confirming the collapse of the Soviet hold over Bessarabia. Civilian populations bore the brunt of this phase of the campaign. Those who had not fled earlier now faced the consequences of Axis occupation. Romanian authorities quickly moved to reassert control, establishing administrative structures in towns and villages. Laws and institutions from before 1940 were reinstated, while Soviet symbols and institutions were dismantled. Propaganda framed this as the rightful return of the province to Romania. But the reoccupation came with heavy burdens. Food and housing shortages persisted, while many families discovered their homes destroyed or looted. Suspected collaborators with Soviet authorities were arrested, and in some cases, deportations began. Ethnic minorities, particularly Jews, faced severe persecution as Romanian policies aligned with broader Axis racial laws. For civilians, the end of battle did not mean the end of suffering, but the beginning of a new and often harsher reality. Romanian troops themselves were exhausted by this stage. Divisions that had entered the campaign with 12,000, 15,000 men often counted fewer than 8,000 by the time they reached the Dniester. Losses included not only casualties but also illness, desertion, and the strain of continuous combat. German observers acknowledged the high price Romania had paid for the reconquest of Bessarabia. In Berlin, the contribution was celebrated as proof of Romania's loyalty to the Axis cause. But the disparity in losses between Romanian and German formations highlighted the unequal burden of the campaign. This imbalance would shape future relations within the alliance. The Soviet Ninth Army, though battered, was not entirely destroyed. Many formations succeeded in crossing the Dniester, where they reassembled under new orders to prepare the defense of Odessa. Stalin and the Stavka viewed the loss of Bessarabia as a setback, but insisted on transforming Odessa into a fortress city that could delay the Axis advance further. The survival of significant Soviet forces, even after the disasters along the Prut, ensured that the southern front would remain contested. Thus, while the battles in Bessarabia ended with Axis occupation, they directly set the stage for the next major campaign on the Black Sea coast. For the international community, the end of the Prut battles carried symbolic weight. In Bucharest, Antonescu proclaimed victory, presenting the recapture of Bessarabia as the fulfillment of Romania's national mission. Crowds celebrated in the capital, though the high casualties were only partly acknowledged in official statements. German propaganda used the victory to emphasize the strength of the Axis coalition. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet radio reframed the retreat as a temporary setback, focusing instead on stories of sacrifice and emphasizing the defense of Odessa as the new line of resistance. In Allied capitals, the rapid Axis success in the south confirmed the scale of the threat facing the Soviet Union, but also revealed the enormous cost that Germany's allies were willing to bear. The withdrawal phase of the Prut battles thus concluded with a decisive territorial outcome. Romania had regained Bessarabia, and the Soviet Union had been pushed back across the Dniester. Yet the immediate consequences were far more complex. The campaign left behind devastated landscapes, shattered communities, and armies exhausted by weeks of attritional combat. It also marked the transformation of Romania from a participant seeking limited objectives into a fully committed partner of Germany, drawn deeper into a war that would soon extend far beyond its original goals. The bloody struggles along the Prut were over, but their consequences would resonate in the battles that followed. The legacy of the Prut River battles in June-July 1941 extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. On the surface, the campaign had achieved its primary Axis objective, the reconquest of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Romanian forces, supported by the German 11th Army and Luftwaffe, had successfully crossed the Prut, defeated the Soviet 9th Army in a series of engagements, and advanced to the Dniester River. For Bucharest, this was presented as a national triumph, erasing the humiliation of June 1940, when the territories had been lost without a fight. Yet the true consequences of the campaign were more complex, shaping Romania's role in the war, Soviet strategic responses, and the broader dynamics of the Eastern Front. For Romania, the battles marked both redemption and entrapment. Marshal Ion Antonescu was celebrated as the leader who had restored national honor, Parades in Bucharest emphasized the sacrifice of the army and glorified the fallen as martyrs of the Holy War of Liberation. Yet the cost had been staggering. Romanian armies suffered tens of thousands of casualties in just over a month of fighting. Many divisions were severely depleted, and morale was shaken by the realization that the campaign had been far bloodier than anticipated. Despite Antonescu's early declarations that the war's aim was limited to recovering lost provinces, by August 1941, Romania was already deeply embedded in Germany's broader war effort. The Wehrmacht demanded continued Romanian participation in the advance toward Odessa and beyond, gradually pulling the country into a conflict of continental scale. For the Soviet Union, the loss of Bessarabia was interpreted as a serious but not decisive defeat. Stalin and the Stavka rapidly shifted focus to the defense of Odessa and the preparation of deeper defensive lines in Ukraine. The sacrifices of the Ninth Army and the resistance along the Prut were incorporated into the Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War, emphasizing that every setback was temporary and that each delaying action bought time for the Soviet war machine to mobilize. Propaganda highlighted acts of heroism by riflemen, tank crews, and civilians, framing the battles as part of a larger story of resilience. In strategic terms, the campaign revealed weaknesses in Soviet command and logistics, but it also demonstrated the Red Army's capacity to resist even under surprise attack. These lessons would shape subsequent defensive operations across the southern front. The broader military significance of the Prut battles lay in their contribution to the overall tempo of Operation Barbarossa. Although overshadowed by the massive encirclements in Belarus and Ukraine, the campaign in Bessarabia absorbed substantial Soviet forces and delayed the Axis timetable in the south. German planners had expected a quicker collapse, yet the Soviet defense along the river, combined with scorched earth tactics and counterattacks, forced the Axis to commit greater resources than anticipated. Romanian forces bore the brunt of this cost, highlighting both their importance and their limitations within the Axis coalition. The campaign thus illustrated the uneven distribution of burdens among Germany's allies, a pattern that would persist throughout the war. For civilians, the legacy of the Prut battles was one of devastation and upheaval. Villages were destroyed by artillery, crops burned, and entire communities displaced. Under Soviet rule in 1940 to 1941, many had already experienced deportations and political repression. Under Axis occupation after July 1941, they now faced requisitions, persecution, and the imposition of harsh administrative controls. Ethnic minorities, particularly Jews, bore the heaviest suffering as Romanian authorities implemented discriminatory policies and initiated deportations. The population of Bessarabia thus endured a succession of traumatic regimes, each leaving scars that would shape collective memory for decades. Internationally, the campaign had diplomatic implications. Germany showcased Romania's contribution as evidence that the Axis was not a purely German enterprise, but a coalition of nations united against the Soviet Union. Italy and Hungary observed closely, noting the heavy price paid by Romania, while Britain and the United States interpreted the campaign as proof that Hitler's ambitions had engulfed Eastern Europe. In London, the persistence of Soviet resistance, even in defeat, was seen as a sign that the USSR might endure longer than expected, strengthening arguments for increased aid. In Washington, the reports of destruction and civilian suffering contributed to the growing perception of the war as a global struggle demanding eventual American involvement. In historical perspective, the Prut River battles became an early symbol of the brutality of the Eastern Front. They demonstrated the intensity of combat from the very first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, foreshadowing the vast losses and devastation that would characterize the entire war in the East. The campaign revealed the vulnerability of small states caught between great powers, the costs of alliance with Nazi Germany, and the determination of the Soviet Union to resist despite setbacks. It also set the stage for subsequent campaigns, the siege of Odessa, the advance into Ukraine, and the protracted struggle for control of the Black Sea region. Commemoration and memory of the battles evolved differently in Romania and the Soviet Union. In Romania during the Antonescu regime, the victories were celebrated as national redemption, After the war, under communist rule, the narrative shifted, portraying Romanian involvement in 1941 as a tragic mistake imposed by fascist leadership, while emphasizing Soviet heroism in defending Bessarabia. In the Soviet Union, the battles were remembered less for their immediate outcome than for the resilience they symbolized in the early, darkest days of the war. In both countries, the legacy remained politically charged, reflecting broader debates about responsibility, sacrifice, and the meaning of national survival. In the end, the Prut River battles of 1941 were both a local struggle for territory and a component of one of the largest military operations in history. They decided the fate of Bessarabia for the next 3 years, reshaped Romania's role in the war, and revealed the immense human and material costs of the Eastern Front. Though often overshadowed by larger campaigns, the fighting along the Prut left an enduring imprint on the war's trajectory and on the memory of the peoples who lived through its devastation.